It was February 3rd, 1989, and the Vogue nightclub in Seattle was packed with maybe 200 people, most of them drunk, most of them not really paying attention to the skinny blonde kid on stage screaming into a microphone that kept cutting out. Kurt Cobain was 21 years old, broke, sleeping on friends' couches, and playing to crowds that treated his band like background noise for their conversations and beer runs. Nirvana had been together for about 2 years at this point, grinding through the Seattle underground scene, playing dive bars and basements for gas money and free beer. They had released their first album, Bleach, on Sub Pop Records 6 months earlier, and while it had gotten some attention in the local scene, they were still nobody outside of the Pacific Northwest. Just another loud band in a city full of loud bands. Tonight's show at the Vogue was typical. The sound system was terrible. Kurt's guitar kept going out of tune from the humidity and sweat, and the crowd was more interested in socializing than listening. But Kurt didn't care. When he was on stage, when he had a guitar in his hands, nothing else mattered. He poured everything he had into every song, thrashing around the tiny stage like his life depended on it. They were halfway through their set, burning through a raw version of School, when Kurt noticed something change in the room. The background chatter was dying down. People were actually turning toward the stage. More importantly, the crowd near the door was parting, creating a path for someone walking through. Kurt couldn't see who it was through the stage lights and the sweat in his eyes, but he could feel the energy shift. Whoever just walked in was someone important, someone the Seattle music scene recognized and respected. He kept playing, kept screaming the lyrics, but part of his attention was now focused on that figure moving through the crowd. The song ended in a wall of feedback and crashing drums. Kurt looked up, wiping the sweat from his face, and that's when he saw him. Standing near the soundboard, arms crossed, watching the stage with an intensity that made Kurt's stomach drop, was Eddie Vedder. Eddie Vedder wasn't famous yet. Pearl Jam wouldn't release their first album for another 2 years. But in Seattle in 1989, Eddie was already a legend in the underground scene. He was the singer for Temple of the Dog. He'd been in Bad Radio, and everyone who knew anything about music in Seattle knew that Eddie Vedder was going to be huge. He had that thing that you couldn't teach, that presence, that voice, that star quality that made people stop and pay attention. And he was here, at the Vogue, watching Nirvana, watching Kurt. Kurt felt something he almost never felt on stage: self-consciousness. Suddenly, he was aware of how sloppy their sound was, how the guitar had been out of tune, how he'd forgotten some of the words to the last verse. He looked at Chris Novoselic, his bassist, who had also noticed Eddie and was looking equally freaked out. The next song in their set list was Negative Creep, one of Kurt's most aggressive, most personal songs. For a moment, Kurt considered skipping it, playing something more polished, more accessible. But then something shifted inside him. Eddie Vedder was here to see what Nirvana was really about, so Kurt was going to show him exactly that. No compromises, no apologies. Kurt attacked Negative Creep with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He screamed the lyrics like they were being torn from his throat, thrashed his guitar until his fingers bled, threw himself around the stage with abandon. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was raw emotion, pure catharsis, everything that made Kurt who he was, channeled into 3 minutes of controlled chaos. When the song ended, Kurt looked up at where Eddie had been standing. He was still there, but his arms were no longer crossed. He was leaning forward, completely engaged, a slight smile on his face. And then Eddie did something that Kurt would never forget. He nodded. Just a small nod, but it was a nod of recognition, of respect, of one artist acknowledging another. Nirvana finished their set with About a Girl, the closest thing they had to a melodic song, and the crowd actually applauded, which was rare for the Vogue on a random Friday night. As Kurt unplugged his guitar and started breaking down his equipment, he kept glancing toward where Eddie had been standing, but the Temple of the Dog singer had disappeared into the crowd. Kurt figured that was it. Eddie had stopped by out of curiosity, watched a few songs, and left. It was still more validation than Kurt usually got from anyone outside his immediate circle. He was packing his guitar into its battered case when he heard a voice behind him. "Hey man, great set." Kurt turned around, and there was Eddie Vedder standing about 3 feet away, holding 2 beers. The Vogue's backstage area was just a corner of the club separated by a curtain, so it wasn't exactly private, but Eddie had sought him out, which meant something. "Thanks," Kurt said, trying to keep his voice steady. He wasn't good at small talk, especially not with people he admired. "Didn't know you were going to be here." "I wasn't planning on it," Eddie said, handing one of the beers to Kurt. "I was walking by, heard the noise, and decided to check it out. I'd heard about you guys, but hadn't caught a show yet." Kurt took the beer but didn't open it. His hands were shaking slightly, and he didn't want Eddie to notice. "What did you think?" he asked, then immediately regretted it. He sounded desperate for approval. Eddie took a long drink of his beer before answering. "I think you're doing something different," he said finally. "Everyone in Seattle is trying to sound like Soundgarden or Mudhoney. You're doing your own thing." "I don't know if that's a compliment or not," Kurt said. "It's a compliment," Eddie said. "The biggest compliment. Being original in a scene this incestuous is almost impossible." They stood there in awkward silence for a moment. Kurt could hear the next band setting up on stage, could hear the crowd starting to fill back in. He wanted to keep this conversation going, but he didn't know how. "Can I ask you something?" Eddie said suddenly. "Why do you look so angry up there?" The question caught Kurt off guard. "I'm not angry." Eddie smiled. "Man, you look like you want to burn the whole world down every time you play." Kurt thought about that for a moment. "Maybe I do," he said quietly. "Sometimes I feel like the world deserves it." Eddie's expression changed. The casual friendliness was replaced by something more serious, more intense. "I get that," he said. "I get that completely." And then Eddie Vedder did something that would change Kurt Cobain's life. He started talking, not small talk, not industry gossip, but real talk, about growing up feeling like an outsider, about the anger and frustration of seeing injustice everywhere and not knowing how to fix it, about using music not as entertainment, but as survival, as the only way to process emotions too big and too complicated for normal conversation. Kurt had never had a conversation like this with another musician. Most of the people in the Seattle scene were more interested in comparing gear or talking about which labels were scouting which bands. But Eddie was talking about the things that Kurt thought about at 3 a.m. when he couldn't sleep, the things that made him write songs in the first place. They talked for over an hour, long after Nirvana had finished packing up, long after the next band had started and finished their set. They moved from the backstage area to the alley behind the Vogue, sitting on milk crates next to a dumpster, passing a bottle of cheap whiskey back and forth that Eddie had procured from somewhere. "You know what your problem is?" Eddie said at one point, and Kurt braced himself for criticism. "You're trying to hide how smart you are. You write these incredibly intelligent, subversive lyrics, but you bury them under all that noise and screaming because you don't want people to think you care too much." Kurt was quiet for a long moment. "How did you know that?" "Because I do the same thing," Eddie said. "We both know that the minute you let people see that you actually give a damn about something, they can use it against you. So we hide behind the anger and the volume." The conversation shifted to the Seattle music scene, and here Eddie's tone changed, became more urgent. "Something's about to happen," he said. "I don't know exactly what or when, but I can feel it. Seattle is about to explode. All these labels from California and New York are starting to circle. They smell blood in the water." "You think that's a good thing?" Kurt asked. "I think it's inevitable," Eddie said, "and I think you need to be ready for it. Because when it happens, when Seattle blows up, you're either going to ride that wave or get crushed by it." Kurt took another drink from the bottle. "I don't know if I want to be famous," he said. "I just want to make music." Eddie laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Man, you don't get to choose. If you're good enough, if you're real enough, fame is going to find you whether you want it or not." The only choice you have is how you handle it when it comes. They talked about the compromises that came with success, about how to maintain artistic integrity while working with major labels, about the danger of becoming the thing you used to hate. Eddie had clearly thought a lot about this, had strategies and ideas about how to navigate the music industry without losing yourself in the process. But then the conversation took a turn that Kurt wasn't expecting. Eddie started talking about something more personal, more painful. He talked about his stepfather, about growing up feeling like he didn't belong in his own family, about the anger that came from being told you weren't good enough, weren't wanted, weren't loved. Kurt felt something crack open inside him. He'd never talked about his own childhood with anyone except a few close friends. But something about Eddie's honesty, about the way he shared his own pain without shame or self-pity, made Kurt feel safe enough to do the same. "My parents divorced when I was 9, Kurt heard himself saying, "and I've been angry about it every single day since then." He talked about bouncing between his mom's house and his dad's house, never feeling welcome in either place, about his dad's disappointment that Kurt wasn't interested in sports or cars or any of the things that normal boys were supposed to care about his mom's new husband who made it clear that Kurt was an inconvenience, a burden, a problem to be solved. Eddie listened without interrupting, without offering empty platitudes or trying to fix anything. He just listened, and that was exactly what Kurt needed. "That's why the music matters so much," Kurt said. "It's the only place where I feel like I have any control. The only place where I can say what I really think and feel without someone telling me I'm wrong or I'm too sensitive or I need to man up." Eddie nodded. "The music is the truth," he said. "Everything else is just noise." It was past 2 a.m. when they finally stood up from the milk crates, both of them unsteady from the whiskey and the emotional weight of the conversation. Eddie put a hand on Kurt's shoulder. "Listen," he said. "I'm telling you this because I think you need to hear it. What you're doing matters. The songs you're writing, the way you perform, it's real in a way that most music isn't. Don't let anyone convince you to water it down or make it more commercial or more accessible. Stay angry. Stay real." Kurt felt tears starting to form and blinked them back. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because someone should have told me when I was starting out," Eddie said. "And because I have a feeling that a year from now, maybe 2 years from now, you're going to be so big that you won't remember this conversation. But I want you to remember it. I want you to remember that there was a time when you played to 200 people in a shitty club and gave everything you had. And that was enough." They exchanged phone numbers, scribbled on napkins from the bar. Eddie said they should get together again, maybe collaborate on something. Kurt said yes, but in his heart he didn't really believe it would happen. People said things like that all the time in the music scene, and it rarely led anywhere. But as Eddie walked away into the Seattle night, Kurt felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not hope that Nirvana would get famous or successful, but hope that maybe there were other people out there who understood, who felt the same things he felt, who were fighting the same battles. He loaded his equipment into Christ's van, and on the drive back to the apartment where he was crashing that week, he kept thinking about what Eddie had said. Stay angry. Stay real. Don't let anyone convince you to water it down. 3 months later, Kurt would write a song called Lithium about emotional numbness and the search for meaning. 6 months after that, Nirvana would sign with DGC Records and begin recording Nevermind. 18 months after the night at the Vogue, Smells Like Teen Spirit would be the biggest song in America, and Kurt Cobain would be the most famous rock star in the world. But in those crucial months when Kurt was deciding what kind of artist he wanted to be, when he was figuring out how to translate his anger and pain and confusion into something universal, Eddie Vedder's words echoed in his head. Stay angry. Stay real. Years later, after Nevermind had changed everything, after grunge had become a marketing term and Seattle had become a brand, Kurt would sometimes think back to that night at the Vogue. He and Eddie had both ridden the wave that Eddie predicted, had both become exactly as famous as Eddie feared they might. They'd stayed in touch, sporadically. A phone call here, a message through mutual friends there. When Pearl Jam released 10 in 1991, just a month before Nevermind came out, Kurt called Eddie to congratulate him. When Nirvana played Saturday Night Live, Eddie sent a telegram to Kurt's hotel that just said, "I told you so." But the relationship was complicated by fame and competition and the media's insistence on pitting Seattle bands against each other. Pearl Jam and Nirvana were constantly compared, constantly ranked, and it created a tension that neither Kurt nor Eddie wanted, but neither could completely escape. Still, Kurt never forgot that conversation in the alley behind the Vogue. When the pressure of fame became too much, when record executives wanted him to write more radio-friendly songs, when people accused him of selling out or complained that his music was too abrasive, Kurt would remember Eddie's words. The night at the Vogue mattered because it was the last moment before everything changed. It was the last time Kurt Cobain was just another struggling musician in Seattle, unknown and unproven. After that night, the trajectory was set. The wave was coming, just like Eddie said it would. What Eddie Vedder gave Kurt that night wasn't advice about the music industry or tips on songwriting. It was permission to be exactly who he was, permission to stay angry and real and uncompromising, even when it would have been easier to smooth the edges and fit in. And Kurt Cobain took that permission and used it to change music history.